So I hope you enjoyed our last commercial break, and our continuity writers who currently are not walking on the strike line for the Writers Guild gave us a really good segue into this episode by carrying forward one of our main characters, Karen. So I'm Rick Borchelt, Special Assistant to the Director here in the Office of Science, and with Keegan Sawyer, one of your executive producers for today's show. But before we get to the cast list for the episode, I wanted to say a few things for context based on some of the other programs and the conversations we've had earlier today. As Matt previewed for us in that first content episode this morning, a lot of people turn their nose up at communication modes and techniques from public relations and advertising and marketing. This is as true for many in organized science leadership as it is for many in the media. But I think as we've seen throughout the program today, and especially in this last episode, these are the very modes that are most likely to create linkage from basic science to popular culture. Think of it, if you will, as product placement. But as asked earlier, the question is, what product are we placing in popular media and popular culture, and how? And what that placement does for us in crafting public-friendly understanding of basic science and its role in popular culture. So a lot of the conversation today during the sessions has been about how to jump on opportunities that arise in popular culture. We'd like to take that one step further in this episode and explore a little bit more how to plan rather than stumble onto these opportunities. Our main feature presentation, Maureen Taylor, is just the person to help us unpack a number of these issues for us. As one of the world's foremost scholars in public relations and communications management, she's currently at the University of Technology, Sydney as Professor of Strategic Communication in the School of Communication, where she's been since 2019. She's the author of more than 70 academic journals, articles in national and international publications, including Journal of Communication and Communication Theory. She's an author or co-author of 40 book chapters and 4 edited books, and is editor-in-chief of the world's longest established public relations journal, Public Relations Review. Think of Public Relations Review as nature or science for public relations. Some of us with Oak Ridge ties also remember her tenure as director of the School of Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Tennessee. Dr. Taylor's public relations research is focused on nation building and civil society, dialogue, and engagement, and especially around new technologies. We're delighted she could join us here, even with the wide gap in time zones, to tell us a little bit more about her work in that area. Maureen, are you ready for your close-up?
I am.
Right. Welcome.
Okay, let's see if I can share my slides. And let's see, because I don't do this every day for teaching. All right, how's that? Can you see my slides?
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. I am coming to you today from Sydney, Australia, where I migrated 4 years ago after working across many American universities in public relations. And the title today of my presentation is Public Relations is Not a Dirty Word. I got up early this morning because right now it's 6:10 in the morning, but I got up around 2:30 a.m. so I could jump on to see all of the other panels and these flash presentations and all these really nice PowerPoints and videos and all of these other great communication tactics and strategies that you're using. So in some ways, it's wonderful to be one of the last featured speakers, but it's also horrible because it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon across the East Coast. A lot of people are thinking about heading out. And more importantly, I have to compete with all of the great videos and all of the great content that you saw before. So you'll see some slides with a lot of text, but hopefully I'll be able to put them in context of what we've been able to see. Now, I will start with something that we do in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, where we acknowledge where we are. And I'm acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands my university stands. And I'm paying respects to the people, past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge of the lands that I am presenting to you today. Thank you for inviting me to talk about public relations. It's funny, you've talked about public relations the whole time, and yet we almost never use the word public relations. We've talked about social media. We talked about a little advertising and marketing and content creation. We've talked about audience, but we really haven't talked about that word. And the reason that we don't talk about that word is that word has a lot of negative connotation. When you hear that somebody studies or works in public relations, many people's first response is they're spin doctors, they're flacks, they're hacks, they work for the man or the woman, or a lot of other terms that shouldn't be used in polite company. And the public relations field has the worst public relations in the entire world, right? Because for some reason, we're horrible at telling our story. So let me see if I can help change that story for you. And indeed, a couple of you mentioned ChatGPT today. Well, I put into ChatGPT about, what are some of the concerns about public relations? And it kindly told me that it is the manipulation of information, the lack of authenticity, ethical concerns, manipulation of public opinion, and a focus on short-term gains. So my task today is to actually counter all of those and tell you why public relations is not a dirty word and actually shouldn't be embraced by all of us, whether we work in the communication field or in basic or applied science. First, we should acknowledge that public relations is everywhere. Right? And even if we don't call it public relations, and I actually wrote an article about the Gillette Amendment that stops the US government from spending money on public relations. Now, anybody who works in government says, well, of course we do public relations, what we call it public affairs or public information. One of our first tasks, I think, is actually to eliminate the Gillette Amendment so we can actually have an honest conversation about the role of communication, information, and indeed persuasion in society. So hopefully many of you see your roles here, whether it's in government or education or nonprofit or issues management or any kind of the activities that we do in public relations, such as listening, stakeholder engagement, risk and crisis communication in general. And indeed, what makes public relations special is it leverages every kind of communication channel, from our interpersonal, organizational, to the traditional print, television, radio, to today's digital media, podcasts, social media, influencers, and even the old-fashioned speeches that many of us write for organizational leaders as they face the public, or at least face the media. So what I want to do is talk about why the approach that you take and the way that you define public relations matters a great deal. Now, definitions are really important, especially for people in science, because how we define something will influence how we study it or how we practice it. And in many of our definitions about public relations, we make certain assumptions. We make assumptions about people, processes, the meaning, power, and of course, media. So I want to take you through a little history lesson, not quite like back to Jurassic Park, but maybe back about 40 years to when the field of public relations started as an academic and a business communication function that had been recognized and given resources and organization, to sort of today's perspective that I'm advocating for. The definition of public relations is evolving, and if you look online, you'll see many, many definitions. Indeed, the field is really good about defining what it is. It's just really bad at explaining how it helps to contribute to society. But how you define public relations will influence how you practice it. Now, we started in the 1980s and 90s with a management-oriented definition, and it's really important to put this into perspective. An academic and professional field needs to be recognized and resourced for it to move forward. That's when salaries get higher. We start seeing the differentiation of task of management and line workers or tacticians. So the 1994 definition by James Gruding and Todd Hunt is really important. And it set out to place public relations as a management function, much like you would do like the accounting and the finance function in an organization. And this had a really important role because we wanted to be in that at the table when decisions were being made, because public relations job was supposed to be to help the organization understand the public. So the key concepts in this definition are about the management of communication between an organization and its public. And in the time of In Search of Excellence, this definition, which came out of excellence theory in public relations, captured that management function. Later on, we have another organizational definition of public relations that focuses on communication. Public relations is the use of communication to negotiate relationships amongst groups. So we see a little bit of an evolution of the concept where we're now thinking about relationships, communication, there's both individual and organizations, and this real idea of negotiation. Now, anybody who's ever been in a relationship will tell you that negotiation is hard, right? Because we rarely want the same thing as others. And in a society where organizations have specific goals and interests, and publics have specific goals and interests, there's always this role for negotiation. So this in the late 1990s definition. And in the spirit of transparency, Carl Botan was my advisor at Purdue University. Now, I decided to try to outdo my advisor, and so I came up with a definition of public relations that takes more of a macro societal definition. And this is based on a lot of my work that Rick mentioned about how I've worked in civil society and nation building. And I've actually applied public relations theories and concepts and frameworks to trying to help recreate relationships in societies and communities that have suffered a crisis. So I've worked in the former Yugoslavia, Liberia, Sudan, Iraq, Pakistan. I've worked in all these different areas, trying to understand how we can create and recreate flows of information that create shared meaning in society. So I take a much more macro view. It's not organizational centric. Instead, it's about how communication and information helps members of society better understand each other and come to shared meaning. So the key concepts here are the co-creation of meaning, flows of information, society, and diverse media. So what does a societal approach to public relations look like that's a little bit different than, say, the management or the communication approaches? Well, it's the idea of a strategy with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Now, I listened today to many of the presentations, and what you were so proud, and I'm so happy for you, that you were able to actually show the outputs and some early outcomes of your communication, right? So you've been able to talk about your podcast downloads and your social media hits. But what we really do in public relations to make it at a higher level is actually have higher level objectives about awareness and information, attitude change, and eventually, in some ways, behavior change. We want to be open and transparent, and we know that's really difficult because many organizations have many things they can't talk about. We want to understand that communication creates social reality and it allows for shared meaning. As all of you who look into the cesspool of social media today know, we really do need to find ways to come out with shared meaning. We need to have organizations understand that they need to be interested in meeting societal expectations. And that's actually what public relations' strongest role can be, is listening and taking perspective, the L down there, so that we can help our organization adapt and change to before regulation or public perception and action forces us to change. We believe in engagement, that we can build relationships among groups and networks really matter. We want to recognize that the best communication relationships are built on trust, and that trust is growing over time, and that this appropriateness of the right media at the right time to reach the right group on the right message is really the most important thing about being strategic. And listening, of course, it comes at the end, but it really should be up there with the I. So how can public relations support new science? Well, first of all, with the idea of the evolving story, right? That our stories need to be targeted to the right audiences, the right time, right platform, all of those issues. We need to identify the best way to reach audiences, and that not every audience is on Instagram and not every single audience wants social media. So we need to be able to tailor the message to our key stakeholder publics. And we need to be able to connect science information to the right people through the right channels to get to the right issues, so we can leverage all of our information and that the outlets can help us. So I don't have a superhero cape picture, but you had enough of them in your presentations. So imagine right now, public relations is standing on a mountaintop with a flowing cape. And I'm going to tell you how public relations can come to the rescue for people who are interested in science communication. First is the idea of audience analysis before any content creation. We want to know who are the individuals most affected by an issue. We want to know the primary actors. You may not have to have a mass approach. You might identify 6 or 7 influencers who could be your target public, who could be the people that you work with. You want to know the institutions and the organizations that are involved in this issue. And of course, it sounds like most of you do. You want to know about which attitudes and beliefs and behaviors that you might want to change or reinforce. You want to know who exhibits these attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs. And you want to understand the psychographic or demographic factors that affect people's beliefs and attitudes. You also want to recognize where there's conflict, right? Because those who are affected are influential voices or actors in that space, because sometimes building consensus isn't always the best approach. Sometimes exploring dissensus is an opportunity for creating new ways of engaging publics. The second way that public relations can come to the rescue is this idea of influence mapping to reach the hard to reach. Now, we know that many of you operate in local, national, and indeed international networks, and relationships are actually the pathways of influence. And you may be surprised what gaps exist or what intermediary groups are critical to the success of your science communication initiatives. You know, an organization attempts to influence others through networks. And a network is about a visualization of how data and information flow through and are disseminated to others in an organization or in a society. And I want to share with you what this might look like, as this might be, after audience analysis, the second way that public relations can help you be more strategic. We understand that relationships exist around a continuum of strong, weak, and absent ties. And social media shows this to us all the time, right? We know who's influential by looking at the number of followers. Or if any of you run network analysis, you can see the people who link or bridge other groups. So when you do your audience analysis and you start thinking about relationships, before you ever create content, think about who are your strong ties, who are your weak ties, and who might have absent ties that are people that you want to reach, but you don't do so right now. But there is this recognition that you have friends of friends who can help introduce you to that group of people. Now, my one graphic here is an example of how we might be able to show influence mapping. Now, I've done this this is part of my project for the US State Department, and how to help embassies across the world reach different stakeholder groups. If anyone knows anybody who works in embassies, there's always the usual suspects who come to most of the events, right? People who have been beneficiaries of the government's programs. But those aren't the people that we need to reach. So what I did here is we went through a mapping exercise where we have the mission. And our first row, right, of our blue or bluish green, those are the people who are our strong ties in that mission. And then we have the yellow ones, who are people who we have some relationship, but not a great relationship with yet. And then we have the people in orange are the young people who the US government activities would like to influence. No, we don't have a direct relationship with them, but we have relationships with other groups. So this understanding of how to reach the hard to reach is a great example of how we understand how relationships can be leveraged for us to develop new relationships. Now, the last part of the PR to the rescue sort of is redundant to what Michael Dahlstrom said, right? It's storytelling. Public relations allows you to leverage the power of storytelling to create a narrative that cradles or holds your science information. Right? It's important for basic science because a lot of people don't understand why we do certain research, like the example of the atom. Right now, today, everything's based around the atom. So having a story to cradle or to embody your information is really important. Making it accessible, interesting, and relevant, and you surround it by facts, findings, and data. Good stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. They often feature heroes and sometimes villains, and they provide context, significance, and meanings. And they create and support the flow of information across diverse media, and they help to create shared meaning in society. The stories that build on other narratives will benefit from these prior narratives as well. So I have now spent my 15 minutes that they've asked, and I want to ask you right now, do you think that you have a different definition of how public relations can help your communication of basic science? And do you think that you could use what I've shared with you about a societal approach to leverage popular culture to further extend the outcomes of your strategic communication? I hope so.
Thank you so much, Maureen. We have some questions and issues already building in the chat. And if you have questions or answers to Maureen's question, put them in chat. And before we get to them, I'd like to introduce our two discussants today, Bryan Field and Karen McNulty Walsh. Bryan's currently a program manager in the Cosmic Frontier program in high energy physics here at the Office of Science. Previously, he was an associate professor of physics at Farmingdale State College on Long Island, New York, where his research interests concern theoretical high energy particle physics centered on understanding results from the LHC and CERN at the French-Swiss border. He's been awarded a Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching, the highest merit-based award given within the State University of New York system, before he left academia for the Department of Energy. Bryan's also an award-winning playwright and a published poet, and he has a deep and abiding interest in science communication. Sticking with the Long Island connection, Karen is a principal media and communication specialist at Brookhaven National Lab, where we've been lucky enough to have her writing about science there since 1999. Her earlier career was dedicated to writing and editing science articles for children, in part to inspire passion for science and appreciation for the scientific method, and also to help young readers become informed citizens and decision makers. She started out as assistant editor of Scholastic Science World Classroom magazine, rose to the rank of editor, and later took positions as managing editor and editor of Zillions. Some of you may remember the children's version of Consumer Report. Her writing for both these publications has been recognized with numerous awards from the Educational Press Association of America. I'd like to give them both a chance to share some reflections on Maureen's remarks and then entertain dialogue between the four of us before opening it up to the floor, and I'll traffic cop the questions as they come in and continue to come into the chat. Bryan, would you like to start out?
Yes, thanks, Rick, and thanks for a wonderful presentation, Maureen. I have to say, I when they sent me some articles that you had written, and I saw that they were in journals called Public Relations, it did raise my eyebrow initially. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that after your presentation, all your fears can be set aside. I think I understand it much better than I used to. And I particularly like this idea of strong and weak ties, the kind of formalization of how you can get to an audience that you want to reach by reaching an audience that you can reach. And although probably would have stumbled across that on my own, I think your presentation definitely made that process much easier to understand.
Karen?
So I definitely resonate with the perception of public relations as a negative, having a negative connotation. In fact, before I took my job at Brookhaven, I went to the director of my Master's in Journalism program at NYU and said, what do you think, working at Brookhaven, like as in PR? And of course, he's the reason I know about Brookhaven, because he took his students out to the lab every single year. So I had visited the lab when I was a graduate student in journalism. And he said, well, you know what? You're not hawking a product, you're hawking science. And so I have reframed my perception from the very beginning as, yeah, I'm not here to sell a product. I'm here to sell the value of research, the value of science, to sell the excitement about science. And I'm lucky to be in a place where there are amazing scientists doing great work, and there are so many great stories to tell. I don't know if that's enough of an introduction to get the conversation started. All right, let's go.
It is, and I'm going to take the moderator's privilege of asking the first sort of question out of here, and it has to do with a couple of the comments and questions that have been bubbling up in chat, which have to do with how we identify ourselves to our leadership and how we identify ourselves to our other external stakeholders. And for some of us, I guess the question becomes, can we speak truth to power in a leadership situation? So many of us, I think our biggest issue has to do with training our leadership about what it is public relations is and is not. And particularly in the context of, as we've been talking today, advertising and marketing, we're not really advertising arms of the organization. We're not really marketing arms of the organization, but that's what a lot of times the leadership seems to expect of us. And how would you counsel us then to interact with our leadership to change their perception of what, besides having you come and give this presentation to our leadership, how would you help us unpack that for our leadership?
I think a couple things. Number one, I would, everyone is so aware now of public perceptions. So in the past, it's always been about how the organization has tried to influence publics, right? Through public relations, through one-way communication. And I think we can now, especially we have social media and we have, well, of course, media coverage. We can explain that what public relations does is it helps us to listen to and react to and help our organizations change to meet societal expectations before they become an issue. Right. And I think that's one thing, because the only time that public relations ever really is sought after quickly is when there's a crisis. Or like, hey, get me that gal down in PR, right? We got something going on here. If they'd listen to that gal in PR, they might not be having this. So back to the first definition of public relations that I shared with you, we really do need to have a seat at the table to be perceived as being knowledgeable and having insights that other people don't have. So that would be number one. And then number two, I think by sharing our research, right? Really good public relations begins with and ends with research. So you're constantly understanding what's happening in the legal, political, social, scientific, environmental situation. So being that expert on what's happening outside the organization and being able to bring it in and package it in a way that becomes useful to decision makers is the second way that we can add value. And I think third, and this may not be popular to many of the people on the call, but to get past just that public relations is social media, right? It's only one way that we interact with, engage, and listen to different groups. And it's always my fear, and if I hope, I don't know, Bryan, what they sent to you, but if we become just the social media function, then that's all we're viewed as. And then we're just like just a channel to reach groups in a one-way communication. And that's not really going to help organizations anticipate and change to meet societal expectations.
That's very helpful, I think, for all of us. Karen?
So we have a lot of experience with both the crisis management and, helping people understand the value of science, and went through sort of a turning point in the time that I started at Brookhaven. We had a little bit of an environmental issue and we had to respond to that. I was not yet working at the lab, and I was in fact brought on to promote the science while other people were dealing with that. So if there are going to be deep questions about this, I'm going to defer to some other folks in my organization. But there was definitely a need. There was a perception that we were secretive place. Despite the fact that we did have a history of open house tours and various other efforts to communicate with the public, but there were definitely perceptions that we were not. And so we did a kind of 180-degree turnaround from what people perceived us to be, formed a community advisory committee, and really got two-way communication going with the community and brought a lot of people in to help work through that situation. And some of those people who were initially critics of the lab, and some, in many cases, there were groups that were trying to shut the lab down. We managed to develop a group of supporters who have stayed with us and been strong supporters for our science and helped us to win new projects and funding. And so I think our lab certainly, management certainly appreciates the value of good communication about the science, about issues. And they do have the person who's in charge of the whole community interaction and public affairs roles at the lab in direct reporting position to the director. So there's a much better relationship there, I think, than maybe there was at the time those incidents happened. They certainly value the communication about the science.
Yeah, and I would add, and this is sort of one of those funny statements for people in the business when they ask, like, well, why do you do the thing that you do all the time for all the people you know, with everyone you know? Communicating the science is part of the process of science, right? You figure the problem, you solve the problem, you write down the answer, but then what? If you just leave it in your drawer, it doesn't help anybody. Even if you just show it to your colleagues in specialized journals, that's only a tiny part of the process. If you think you've discovered or are part of anything of any value at all, you'd want it out to a wider audience. And since graduate school, they've trained us that that's part of the process. And now in government, it's even more important because we don't fit the bill. It's you have to tell the people what we spent their money on, and you want them to think that it was worth it, that it was that they're getting some value for it. And that can be difficult in, say, high energy physics, right? When somebody could realistically say you spent $30 billion to measure the mass of one particle, that doesn't seem like a great return on investment, since it doesn't really mean anything to them. But the overall context of what that number told us about the universe is very easy to understand. And that's what we always say in high energy physics, or what I always say in high energy physics, is that everyone can understand the questions we ask. It's hard to explain the answers, and that's the trick. Because everyone can say, like, do you want to know where the universe came from and where it's going? It's easy to sell those questions. It's hard to say that we need to build a collider and measure this number to know the answer, but that's the communication part. So it's kind of built into what we do at DOE and in science, but I also see it as you can easily frame these questions in a way that makes people actively want to know the answer.
Karen, I know you and I first got to know each other well during that environmental issue that you spoke of obliquely. And I wonder if you could sort of take those 3 levels of relationship ties that Maureen was talking about and tell us a little bit about how you approached community relations in terms of where were your strong ties, where were your weak ties, and where were your absent ties, and what did you do to try to shore those up?
Rick, I would love to answer that question with details, but as I said, I was hired to communicate the science while other people dealt with those things. So I was blessed to not have to worry about too much of that. I can say that there were, certainly the immediate local surrounding community was probably the most up in arms about what was going on, because for those who don't know, there was a leak of a small amount of tritium into groundwater on site on the Brookhaven property, never got off site. But people were worried about radiation in their drinking water. So there was a lot of worry in the local community. My colleagues, Pete Genzer, who's still there today, was deeply involved in going door to door and talking to people, local elected officials we dealt with, obviously people at the Department of Energy. There's a lot of history there and a lot to learn from that experience, but I think the most important lesson was that the transparency that we tried to portray, not portray, we were being transparent. We were issuing 1 million press releases about every single little thing that was happening at the time, almost too much. But it was in an effort to show that we are not hiding anything, and we invited people in to be part of these committees that made decisions about how things happened and went forward after that. So it turned into a success story in the end.
And Maureen, I suspect you would say that was because where those relationships either didn't exist or were very weak, that was the critical piece of trying to get those stakeholders engaged.
Agreed. And sometimes it takes a crisis to actually sit down and say, you know what, we need to do something different. So let's figure out who's our strong tie that we can leverage them to help us reach other groups. Who do we have this opportunity now to build a relationship with at the same time that you're writing 1 million press releases, right? And so that's why I think being well prepared for crisis always helps. And I also think using a crisis as an opportunity. Now, in some of your areas, if there's a crisis, it's not an opportunity to sit around and say, hey, let's go figure out who we don't have a relationship with yet. But there are others, obviously many of you who could do this. So I think so. And I think it's an opportunity to reach out and to see people who you haven't even thought about. And, this is actually something about diversity. We often have relationships with groups who are a lot like us. They might live in the neighborhoods that we live in. They might have the same economic and educational backgrounds. But there's a lot of people who don't have high educations or don't even speak English as their first language. And a crisis is an opportunity to think about how our organization and its actions affect communities and communities of communities or networks and networks. So if we can do it when it's easy and stable and static time, it's better. But it's definitely an opportunity to leverage different types of relationships, recognizing that those absent relationships might actually be really important to leveraging what our organization does and help us achieve our outcomes.
Can I chime in one more thing on that, Rick? Another thing that I think happened, maybe not as a direct result of that, but around the same time, I think there was an evolution in scientists' willingness to talk about the benefits of the science directly. I think the Department of Energy got a little shy with the superconducting super collider overselling potential spin-offs, that were going to benefit society. And then that whole project had lots of issues and ended up not being built. So there was some hesitancy to talk about benefits of science, tangential benefits. So yeah, if we learn something new about a particle or a force, we don't exactly know how that's going to transform the world, but it might, like learning about the atom did. But there are a lot of benefits that come from building these complex machines that we do our science with. And I think that the scientific community became more comfortable with talking about how those developments push the limits of technology and open doors in other areas of science and technology beyond what we're investigating directly. So trying to understand the need to talk about the potential benefits and outcomes of the science alongside, the nuts and bolts of how we do it became more part of the story of science, perhaps motivated by crisis.
Mhm.
One of the questions that came in from Andrea was, how has leadership buy-in changed during your careers? Have you seen a landscape shift here? I think I certainly have, and I'll put the same question to Bryan and Karen after Maureen, you have a chance to look more globally at that.
Sure. And back to the early definition was about public relations becoming a management function. For years, it was just publicity, right? Press agentry, publicity, one-way communication. The truth doesn't matter, P.T. Barnum, all publicity is good publicity. So I definitely think things have changed. And today we have some really savvy CEOs and organizational leaders, whether at institutions of higher education or in government, who recognize the important role that public plays. So I would say it's not even about that we're at higher levels. I think there's just this change that people recognize that our social license to operate comes from the public, whether it's taxpayers, like Bryan mentioned, who fund the 30 billion, government who decides what to do. So I just think we are much more sophisticated about the role of the public in affecting what our organizations do.
So Bryan, if I come back to you, and I know that the high energy physics community right now is hip deep in the next iteration of P5, which is sort of your front face to the rest of the world about what high energy physics and physicists are going to be doing for the next decade. And a lot of thought and care about who the audiences were for the original P5 report was very critical to how that was received in the community and how that was received by policymakers. Can you maybe give a little riff on who you think the strong relationships you currently have in the community are, and where the weak ones are, and where the absent ones are that we'll need to develop for that activity?
Right. So to give a little compare and contrast, so we put out this report about every decade, and P5 is the Particle Physics Prioritization Project, something or other. It's the great acronyms we have in high energy, and it was the last one came out in 2014, and we're in the process of putting out the next one. The 2014 one was, in everyone's words, incredibly well received by everyone higher than me in government, right? And one of the reasons why was because it made difficult choices. So you could come out and write a report about how great it would be to fund every project we've ever had our fingers on, and say they're all important, right? But what that particular report did was says they're all important, but these are the ones that we think in the next decade are going to they're going to move the needle the most. And the funding agencies and the people in Congress who allocate the money, they really, really liked that approach, right? They really, really liked that we had made these hard decisions as a community. And it wasn't it's a large committee. It's like 35 people, and they do this sort of speaking tour where they go around to several of the national labs and universities and Zoom, and they take a lot of input. They get a lot of presentations, and they try to come up with something that's going to work across all of these different fields. Now, as contrast, we were recently contacted by the Professional Organization for Astronomy, and they were trying to sort of recreate this sort of idea, because they also put out a report every 10 years, something called their decadal study, but they don't really make a lot of hard choices in it. And moreover, without disparaging the astronomy community at all, they're much more fragmented than the high energy community is. And so they couldn't exactly do the same thing, because what one part of the community wants is literally the exact opposite of what some of the other community wants. And they weren't able to exactly walk that tightrope. So their report wasn't as well received as our report, because it kind of read like several subcommittees glued a report together, and it didn't have this sort of grand scheme of this is important in the next 10 years and this is not. So in that regard, I think that was the big success, is that our community was able to get buy-in from the scientists doing the research at the lab and university level, and sort of go from there.
Where do you think you need to build absent or weak relationships with the current report?
So I'm not privy to the report, and I'm not part of the committee, but if we could recreate what we did, I think everyone would be happy. But the climate right now of science in general in the country is such that I think if we were to strengthen ties, it's going to have to come with the part of the community that thinks that, you know, that we're hiding things, that there's stuff they aren't privy to. We have to sort of make science again, sort of make it a little more empirical. And that's the further you go in it, the more difficult that can be. It may be super easy in high energy physics, right? Because it's far enough connected from everything else. But I have to say, and this is just my personal view and not the view of anybody else, when we started in high energy talking about things like extra dimensions and other universes and things like this, it was fun. But I think it made people think that we could do anything with it or say anything with it and be taken serious. And that may have led us down an alley that's going to take a long time to get out of, to tell people that, well, these are just speculative ideas and it may not have any influence, but you need to still take us seriously on other topics. So I would say that high energy could lead the way in sort of combating some of that misinformation. And that would be our weakest link right now.
One of the questions from the previous discussion had to do with demonstrating the humanity and connection to society as a whole, and how difficult that is for science. How difficult is that for DOE? And Maureen, what do you think we can do to address that?
Okay. Well, I always, I'm a scholar, researcher. So research always for me is the most important thing. Finding out what are our values and priorities of our target publics, right? And finding out what we share with them and where there's divergence. So I always suggest that that's what we start with. We start with doing research and finding out what do they believe, what do they value, what are their priorities, and how do we serve those? So we start with that connection right there.
I'm gonna pin you down a little bit more on that, because it's a question that I have in mind. And for most of us who are feds anyway, or who are government contractors, it's a little bit of a tricky thing to commission formative and evaluative research in this area. And it's also an expensive thing. So my understanding back in the days when I was studying this more was that in the commercial sector, you would set aside 10 to 15% of your overall project budget to do formative and evaluative research. We're lucky if we get 0.15% to do evaluative and formative research. So what are your suggestions about where we prioritize our research and what we should be trying to do, both formative and evaluative?
And that's a great question. And that's actually what I did for the State Department. They're like, you know what, our embassies can't run primary research on, and they shouldn't, right? Because they've found out that the US government was spending money in a certain country to find out what people think and do. It would be horrible. So what I did was I went through all the different sources that are secondary research reports, studies, Pew, and many others. Now, it won't work in every country, but there's a whole pool of secondary research out there that other organizations have collected that could be used as at least a beginning of your insights into audiences. And then there are other ways. So, we've got census data, and we've got the Pew, and we've got a variety of universities do research around political times. We get lots of political polling that can help us understand values and priorities. So I would say start there, like have your public relations people start putting together sort of a file, like filing cabinet or a drive full of all of these secondary research tools, so that you don't have to go and do money for primary research on it. Start there, and I think you'd be really surprised. And also by talking to other groups who might have other information, and sharing that information could be really valuable as well. So I always say you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of people already collecting information, and we just need to be able to how to identify it and how to apply it. And for me, stakeholder mapping isn't just about relationships, because one of the tasks that I have us do when we do mapping is it's not just who do we talk to, who are our strong and weak ties, but what resources and information and data points do they bring to our relationship. So it's not just that we have a relationship with this group that we can leverage, it's they have resources and information that we can use as well. So it's two things.
There's a question that came in from Keegan asking if the panel could comment on the preparedness issue that we've talked about. How can we use maybe the environmental scanning part of traditional public relations practice, or again, formative research practice, to understand where our next opportunity for engaging popular culture would be? We heard very recently that there was this film Oppenheimer. It's coming out in July. We just saw teasers for it. It's not clear to me yet whether it's going to be a good story for us or not, or how we would interact with it. How do we identify those opportunities well in advance using public relations technology and know-how? That's for all of you.
So
Sarah?
I would say we rely a lot on our social media manager, who does a lot of scanning of trends and things that are going on out in the world. I would also draw on, we don't do this as well as we should, but back to my kids publication era, we did a lot of planning out with editorial calendars and just looked at the science related events that were going to be coming up and made calendars. Any kind of big anniversaries. We look at our own lab history to do that. Are there any big anniversaries at the lab for different facilities or discoveries that we could play up? For example, one that did connect with popular culture that we probably should have highlighted at this meeting was the 50th anniversary. I think it was the 50th anniversary of the invention of the video game, because one of our instrumentation scientists developed a fun little gizmo for a visitor's day using an oscilloscope that basically looked like Pong. And, that was, many people considered that the first 2-player video game on a screen. And we get a lot of stories and a lot of coverage about that all the time. And we planned a fun event around that back whatever year that was. Where we brought in all different versions of old video games and invited the public and invited the media in to play different video games, including our original. But yeah, so looking at what events are coming up, what movies are going to be released, and trying to kind of think about how we might connect with them would be something that we could do.
Maureen or Bryan?
Bryan, you go first, because
Okay.
you're actually living this, and then I'll jump in if there's anything I need to add.
So I have to speak in generalities because this isn't my day job, right? But what I do know from this is that it never hurts to build your audience. Okay, so if you had a good audience that you could talk to about anything, this could be that. And a lot of the comments that I've seen throughout the day has been some version of how do we make the perfect, science communication channel, right? How do we, what would that look like, right? And the problem is that there isn't one, right? If you're the office, if you're the office funny guy, you could be the funny person on Twitter, and someone else can be the serious person, and someone else can be the meme person, and you can kind of use your strengths and go with there. And then when the time comes, everybody can sort of talk about what needs to be talked about. The nice part about that is that once you build an audience, they may be encouraged to follow you to another platform. So if today Twitter is still around, but next month it might not because for whatever reason, well, then that's a huge hole to fill. And all of the practices for Twitter may or may not work. But when you jump ship and you say we're going to go, we're going to go to this new platform X or Y or whatever it's going to be, people will follow you for the content. They're not going to follow you for any other reason, right? And so, generically, I would say that build your audience and work with your strengths. I think I had written down a couple of others here. Science communication is a compromise on information. It can't possibly be everything, even in the most technical talk. It always has to be iterative and progressive. You have to use the power of rhetoric to help you out, particularly when dealing with someone who is interested in your facts. The rhetoric can actually change their mind. And I'd like to be able to talk more about that, but that's all I know about it. It's just something I've sort of been looking into recently and reading about it. And just to close this thought, I'd say if there were a perfect way to do it, we would know by now and we'd all be doing it. And because there's different schemes, it means that there's different ways of doing it.
Maureen.
Bryan, you have the heart of a public relations person, whether you like that or not, trust me on that. I think what Karen said, right? So there's calendars, right? A lot of what we've talked about today is about the creation of content, but that actually is the second or third step after doing research, doing SWOT analysis and PESTLE and all of these other analysis tools that help us then prepare for all of the content creation. So looking at anniversaries, reading the popular press about what Marvel's doing, right? Because we've heard Marvel many times today, or maybe DC, like what's coming down the lane, right? It takes a year, right? The last short video was, we have a year to get ready for the next one. Well, that's just about the right amount of time. So I would say doing your audience analysis, understanding your situation analysis, and then creating that content calendar that helps you to tie into local events or cultural events. And there's essentially a holiday or a day of almost everything, right? If you look at what's today is the day of, and there's World Health Days for the United Nations, there's American days, there's cultural days, there's product days, corporations are like, it's the day of the Twinkie or it's the day of the Oreo cookie, right? You can figure out if you get one of those and you can start figuring out which ones. And the last thing I would say is be strategic and have clear objectives with outcomes, right? 'Cause don't chase everything. Your time and your energy are so valuable. So really just make strategic decisions about the few things that you can do, say in 2024. And then at the end of 24 or mid 24, say, what did we do well and what can we do next year, right? So you can't do everything. So just be really strategic and do it well. And recognize that no matter how much you work, when you're counting on others, such as movie studios or actors or society in general, many times I've had an event scheduled and something came up that was, quote, more important. And I'm like, it's not more important to me, but it was truly more important to the community and society. So we recognize this is just part of that communication flow in society. Sometimes we get our information out and we get to listen to what's happening. And other times we're in this noise. So by having really clear publics, knowing your strong, weak ties, it helps you actually leverage that. So I would say, little by little, and just have a really concrete plan with outcomes and objectives, and that they can be measured.
I'll note from the chat that our friends from Lanel said they already have features planned in conjunction with an alignment with Oppenheimer. And in fact, some of their scientists were extras in the film. One of the questions that I would have in that strategy of sort of picking the product day or picking the popular theme is, how do you decide if something is already going to get a lot of coverage, if you're just going to be in the white noise or it's really worth your while? So I'll just give an example. Earth Day comes every year. We're pushed by the department to, we've got to do all these things for Earth Day. We've got to do all these things for Veterans Day to highlight our veterans. We've got to do all these things for X, Y, or Z, where everybody else is already in the mix. how do we decide to be the leader or pick something discrete that we can own, or pick something where we can sort of play with the rest of the folks, even though we're probably not going to have the budget or the outlay to be able to do the kind of job that they're doing?
So
Sure.
if we find the things that are unique to what we do, we can create those opportunities. So one example is Dark Matter Day, which leverages everybody across not just the DOE labs, but at particle physics research labs across the world that are members of the interactions.org organization. It's a group of science communicators who try to pool their resources, and we're not necessarily organizing a single event. We're just all under the umbrella of Dark Matter Day, and each lab is free to create their own single event or multiple events, social media posts, stories, whatever, that all kind of get packaged under that umbrella and featured on the interactions.org website. I've been tangentially connected to it because I don't do as much of the high energy physics as some of my colleagues, but I've enjoyed being part of that group and the collaborative effort. And there's a lot of energy there, and it's a nice chance to, you know, benefit from making something bigger out of each of our individual efforts.
Maureen,
Excellent. Can I add something?
yes, but I'm gonna anticipate something there for you too, because Maureen would probably say, probably not this, but she would probably say, what was your goal
Mhm.
to start with? And then how did you measure whether you achieved it? You know, we have a bunch of stories on interactions.
Mhm.
And
Well, I mean, in our case, we've had talks that we get people to come in and listen to, you know, our research and how it relates to the search for dark matter and learn about the Large Hadron Collider. So there's a chance to inform a public that might not have been previously connected to science. We do it around Halloween, so there's like a dark matter, spooky science thing, you know, the little bit of a play on something fun, reaching people where they are, and then maybe bringing them in and introducing to something that they had never heard about before. Again, I wasn't directly involved, so I didn't measure anything, and Rick hates me because I never measure anything. I have lots of anecdotal little tidbits.
anecdata.
Okay.
Maureen, you were going to say?
So this is where social science actually can help you. So we have a theory called agenda building theory. So you were talking about how like Earth Day, right? Well, Earth Day is saturated and it's noisy because everybody tries to get their messages out and about on that day in April. But agenda building theory tells us it actually starts 6 weeks earlier. And so you actually can start all of your communication, all of your content calendar, media, and everything else before that. And our theories and our research suggest there's ways that you do it. And that so that the culmination of your event might be on Earth Day, but that you also have some time afterwards. So when we do research, we look at 6 weeks before and 6 weeks after. And often the most successful time is not on the day of the event that you had as your peak. It's actually a little before and a little after because a lot of the noise has disappeared. And so agenda building is a little bit different than agenda setting, but definitely is out there. And it's a wonderful way of structuring your strategy. And that's the other thing. We only should do things that have a clear relationship to our strategic objectives. And we hope that they can be measured, whether it's anecdata or it's through, primary research or secondary research. So strategic planning, just like a scientific team sits down and plans out in advance what they want to accomplish, the same thing in public relations, right? We still need the team input, the strategy, the tactics, and then the evaluation of being able to prove that we were able to accomplish what we saw. And if not, what we learned from it and the lessons learned for next time, so that the next time we do it better.
We're right at about time. I'd like to give the 15 seconds for any folks who would like to, any of the three of you who'd like to add one last item to the conversation before we move to our next commercial break. Any other last thoughts?
Yeah. One quote I wasn't able to wedge in was the famous quote by the bank robber Willie Sutton. Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. So why do we talk to the audience? Because that's where they are. You gotta meet them halfway.
Great.
Well, thank you guys so very much. We really appreciate it. And again, especially Maureen, with the time difference, we really appreciate you being such a trooper for us. Only on BBC and at our summits do you get an uninterrupted commercial-free hour of premium content. But now it's time for our commercial break to watch our final 2 film shorts of the day. Thanks very much.